Thank you all for coming. I appreciate your willingness to be here and talk about Christian media literacy, truth, and love. Joining me today, Reverend Stephen Crippen, curate at Grace Episcopal Church on Bainbridge Island. And in addition to being clergy in this diocese, Stephen was also a therapist dealing with marriage and family therapy. And he will be speaking during the second half of this presentation. The idea for this webinar sprang from a frustration on my part in trying to sift through and distill genuine information from the cacophony of falsehoods and half-truths that permeate the internet media. Claims and counterclaims, often with very vicious and hateful comments, make the work even harder. I came to realize that it was one thing to identify the veracity and hubris of an argument or point of view in this digital world, but it was quite another to conduct meaningful conversations in the sharing of information while, as our baptismal concept says, respecting the dignity of every human being. So I decided to see if I could identify the tools necessary to determine truth or fiction in the data, and then how best to use them not only to inform themselves and others, but also to stay in communion and connection with those whom we disagree. That's the premise of the webinar. This webinar will provide tips and tools to help you become a better consumer of news and information, enhancing your ability to separate fact from fiction. More importantly, also exploring the ways one can correct misleading information and present it in a manner that aids both parties to a better understanding. While researching this topic, I found an invaluable resource that helped pull this all together. The University of Washington has taught a class by the Department of Biology and the Information School entitled Calling Bullshit in the Age of Big Data. The instructors, Dr. Carl Bergstrom and Dr. Jevin West, have created two websites for the course, callingbullshit.org and the sanitized version, callingbs.org, along with their book, with the aim of teaching one how to think critically about the data and models that constitute evidence in the social and natural sciences. The course syllabus and the readings were a great source of background information and case studies for this presentation, and I thank them for the work that they've done. BS has been around for centuries. With the advent of the internet, it has exploded to the point where it is overwhelming in scope and presence. The internet gives an air of applied credibility, in part because it's in print. If we use the definition that Bergstrom and West use, which is BS involves language, statistical figures, data graphs, and forms of presentation intended to persuade by impressing and overwhelming a reader or listener with a blatant disregard for truth, logical coherence, or what information is actually being conveyed. Add to that the ability to reach vast numbers of peoples with the click of a mouse, and you begin to see the problem. The whys of this phenomenon are numerous. Dr. Harry Frankfurt, a professor emeritus of philosophy at Princeton University, wrote a book in 2005 entitled On Bullshit, presents a theory of BS that defines the concept and analyzes the applications of BS in the context of communication. He determined that BS is speech intended to persuade without regard for truth. The liar cares about the truth and attempts to hide it, but the BSer doesn't care if what they say is true or false, but rather only cares that their listener is persuaded. St. Augustine, in his paper Online, asked whether the definition of a lie includes the intention to deceive. He distinguishes lies of 8 different types, which he classifies according to intent or justification. 7 of these include, in some form, the idea of achieving a goal. The remaining one is defined as the lie which is told solely for the pleasure of lying and deceiving. That is the real lie. It is told purely out of a love of deception. In the digital information age, there is another reason why there may be, which is even more pernicious, and that is the drive for money and influence. It costs little when money and influence are created with the click of a mouse. With a change from news with an in-depth analysis to click-driven news, it's the reward that's important. Another reason BS is created and spread is tribalism. In this case, tribalism refers to a way of thinking or behaving in which people are loyal to their social group above all else, or derogatorily, a type of discrimination or animosity based upon group differences. In this instance, they are indifferent to the truth and may not care if they are being persuasive. They want to let people know where they fit in their tribe. So now that we know the what and the why, how do we begin to analyze and respond to falsehoods, fake news, fallacies, poorly or incompletely constructed arguments, and just plain BS? First, we start with skeptical thinking. Carl Sagan, in his 1996 book, The Demon-Haunted World, devoted an entire chapter entitled The Fine Art of Baloney Detection. In this, he said, what skeptical thinking boils down to is the means to construct and to understand a reasoned argument, and, especially important, to recognize a fallacious or fraudulent argument. The question is not whether we like the conclusion that emerges out of a train of reasoning, but whether the conclusion follows from the premise or starting point and whether that premise is true. So here are some points to consider in your skeptical thinking process. Don't fall in love with your hypothesis. Ask yourself why you like the idea. Look at other alternatives and see how they compare. Don't reject another hypothesis out of hand. See if you can find reasons for rejecting it. If you don't do this, others will. Search for independent confirmations. Are there other publications or content which supports these statements? Do these confirmations have a bias to them, or are they unrelated? Occam's razor. Sometimes competing hypotheses or arguments can explain an issue equally well, but become convoluted or complex. The simpler explanation is usually the better one. Who's making this claim? What is their motivation for this claim? How will they benefit from this claim or hinder others? How do they know it? Where do they get their information? What are the facts? What are the opinions? Are they the same or are they different? What's in it for them? Why are they offering this hypothesis, claim, or fact? It is important to keep an open mind and to accept the fact that while the content you are questioning may be BS, there may be facets that are valid and true. If we stay in our own echo chambers with birds of a feather, our tribe, it becomes too easy to dismiss ideas and points of view that do not fit our narrative. Social media and a strongly partisan atmosphere have created a perfect storm for this type of behavior, and we need to be wary of our own biases and prejudices when debunking material we consider BS. There are several ways to determine the validity of an argument or point of view. Some are obvious and straightforward, others may be more technical or complicated. There is often no single test or method one can use to prove or disprove something. In fact, if this is the case, it means the argument or statement is not strong. So how can we test or determine whether the information is real or not? If the claim seems too good to be true, it probably is. Beware of confirmation bias. We're looking for the truth, not a confirmation of our own personal biases. Look at other explanations or working hypotheses. What does the data tell us? How can you look at it in a different way? Look at orders of magnitude. If someone is claiming a value of X to support their hypothesis, what is the scale in relation to X? For example, if some number X, which is a subset of Y, is being used to prove a statement, how does that number compare with Y? One way to do this is through a Fermi estimation, which is a back of the envelope style of estimation. I'll now give you an example of using Fermi estimation to prove or disprove a point. So here's an example of an order of magnitude test using a Fermi estimation. On December 27th, 2016, Fox News carried this story and posted it on their website. Food stamp fraud at all-time highs at time to end the program, $70 million wasted on food stamp fraud. Assuming this number is accurate, the following estimation can be drawn. Assuming 10% receiving food stamps, the average benefit of $1,000 a year, there are 300 million Americans. The total expenditure is 300 million times 10% times $1,000, or $30 billion. The percentage loss to fraud is 70 million divided by 30 billion, which is 0.2%. The typical loss in real estate, or in retail business, is 1.5 to 3%. So interestingly, The Department of Agriculture asked for a correction to this story. As from 2009 to 2011, the USDA claimed that 858 million was the fraudulent number, with the number going down from the 1990s. So if we recalculate, that puts the loss now at 2.8%, which is much more in line with retail loss. Fox retracted the story, but never explained where the 70 million number came from. It appears to have been a manufactured number, but the story ended up going viral. Beware of unfair comparisons, apples and oranges. Look at the relationship between correlation and causation. Two variables are correlated when knowing the value of one gives you information about the likely value of the other. Two states are causally related when one state influences the other via a cause and effect process. So when you read something that says there is a correlation between A and B, test to see if that correlation exists. Often one looks for variables with a high correlation value. Verify that the following is true. If told that A causes B, look for other factors to test the validity. So here's an example of a spurious correlation. Total revenue generated by arcades correlates with computer science doctorates awarded in the United States. These two pieces of information have been graphed, and over the same time period, you notice that the graphs match significantly. However, just because there is a similarity of graph data, it does not necessarily mean they correlate. Causation can have a similar distortion. Many times the idea that B happened after A happened leads people to believe that because of A, B was the consequence. An absurd example of this would be the statement, women caused the nuclear arms race. The causation fallacy is based on the fact that nuclear weapons did not exist before women got the right to vote. Often an algorithm or statistical test is used to defend or validate content. Even if you do not fully understand how it works, you can look carefully at what goes in and what comes out, data going into the algorithm and producing output. The algorithm can have biases built into it, so garbage in, garbage out. Often big data is used to justify or support an idea. However, big data is not a magic bullet. Mechanisms can be fallible or even biased. Be skeptical of big data claims. They could be making too much of the data, called overfitting. They could be too much emphasis placed on a limited amount of the data being used. Think of big data as the idea that a sufficiently large pile of manure somewhere may contain a pony. One way that is used to present a position or support or refute data is data visualization. Data visualization is the graphic representation of data. It involves producing images that communicate relationships within the represented data. A visual representation can quickly present information that the viewer can more easily digest. One must pay close attention to how the information is displayed because it can be deceiving if it is set up improperly or designed with intent to deceive. Frequently, data is presented in a graphical format. If one axis is shortened, for example, it skews the appearance of the data and can misrepresent the relationship of the data. Remember, the visualization of the data can be misleading if you place design over substance. Here's an example of skewing the appearance of data. On April 27, 2011, the Wall Street Journal posted the following data graphic supporting their claim that the middle class is being targeted for a tax increase. However, to show how data can be manipulated to support a preferred claim, Ken Schultz and Brendan Nyan, political scientists from Stanford and Dartmouth respectively, showed that you could take the same data from the IRS and graph it differently based on the size of the bins. You can take any of those graphs to support the position you want to make. Another source of misinformation is publication bias. This bias occurs when authors preferentially report information in journals preferentially publish results. There may not be peer review of the information. Also consider the source of the information. There are predatory journals which appear to be reputable publications, but do not follow normal submission formats and article reviews. These journals publish the author's works and rarely include any negative information, even if there is a peer review. Particularly issues that can be contentious, such as climate change and vaccines, will be published and passed around by those who wish to support a particular claim. To test this, always go back to the source of the information. By looking at the source data, you can make better judgments on the validity of the content. An example of what could be construed as a predatory journal and specious article is the following. The Virology Journal published this article in 2005 on chloroquine, a potential inhibitor of SARS coronavirus infection and spread. This article has been picked up and republished in support of the hydroxychloroquine as a potential cure for COVID-19. This has been debunked by sites such as Scopes.com and PolitiFact.com and has been tagged by social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter as false information that could not be posted or shared. Another clue to determining the predatory journals is their business model. In more established scientific journals such as Lancet, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and the New England Journal of Medicine, the author submits a paper, it is peer-reviewed for accuracy and content, and if approved for submission, is published, and then the journal sends a payment to the author for their paper. In a predatory journal, the author submits the paper along with a fee to essentially ensure publication. Finally, there is fake news. Fake news is not new, but its impact on society in such a grand scale is. There is money to be made in fake news. It costs little to create, and with the change from subscription-based news with in-depth analysis to click-driven news, it makes the monetary reward worth it. If half of news on the internet is fake and half is real, it becomes hard to discern the truth from fabrication. There are ways to verify if news stories are true. Do a web search of the writer to determine their credibility in a list of articles that have written. If no author is cited, you have a red flag as well for that article and any others contained on that site. Be aware that 70% of people do not read beyond the headlines of articles they share. Fake news creators realize this and create clickbait headlines, which may have nothing to do with the actual content. The moral is, read the whole story before liking and sharing it. Look at the article sources. Do they have business or political connections, which might skew the tone and voice of reporting? Even if their connections do not affect the slant of the piece, it helps to know who and what they are so that a more informed appraisal can be made. Beware of content that asks you to send money, join an organization, share the content, or even click this link. Reporting should be fact-based and transparent. If the articles are promoting or selling something, they are usually biased and possibly even fraudulent. Search to see that the article is on multiple sites with different political or social biases. The more you find a story on multiple sites, the greater the chance you will find legitimate news. If a story is on several sites with the same partisan skew only, you can question its integrity. Check to see the type of reporting that is being done. Determine whether it is in-depth analysis, opinion, or advocacy. If the story does not have the 5 W's, who, what, when, where, and why, be suspicious. There are several independent fact-checking sites on the internet to help you analyze the claims, statements, and facts to determine accuracy in reporting. They include Snopes.com, factcheck.org, PolitiFact.com, leadstories.com, sciencefeedback.co, checkyourfact.com, and the WashingtonPost.com/news/fact-checker. Another tool for verifying and vetting news sources is the media bias chart by Ad Fontes Media, whose mission is to make news consumers smarter and news media better. I find this chart very helpful in seeing where a particular data source fits on the political bias. So why do this? I presented a great deal of information to help you discern real from fake, fact from BS, and you can tell that I'm pretty passionate about this subject. I feel this way because this is serious, not merely because this is an election year, but also the cost to society, to relationships, and time and effort it takes to determine what is real. Fake news is an attack on democracy, and if we cannot differentiate between what is true and what is false, we cannot make sound ethical judgments. Alberto Brandolini, an Italian independent software developing consultant, is the original author of Brandolini's Law, aka the bullshit asymmetry principle, which states that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than to produce it. If we hope to heal what is broken in this world, we must do our part to stop the spread. So refute fake news when you see it. Don't spread articles unless you have done some investigating on your own. Buy a subscription to a reputable newspaper that does clear and honest journalism. When you refute BS that have all the information you need, double check your facts and run it by a second set of eyes as a reality check. Think as hard about how to present your argument as you did about how you'd prove your claim in the first place. Avoid the common fallacies of logic and rhetoric, such as ad hominem, which is attacking the arguer and not the argument. Straw man, which is caricaturizing a position to make it easier to attack. Non sequitur, it doesn't follow. Or post hoc ergo propter hoc, which is happened after, so it was caused by. I think more than anything, however, it is important to do this in a way that is respectful. How do we keep our relationships healthy? How do we stay in community with those who we know who post stories or photos which we determine to be false and hurtful? I will now turn over to the Reverend Stephen Crippen to help guide us through that part of our webinar.
Hi, everyone. So I'm approaching this topic from a different angle, which is like, how do you effectively respond to someone you care about when they say or do something that is upsetting to you, or rankles you, or it seems to fly in the face of what you believe or think is real about the world. And so I thought that I would just describe an example of this and then talk about how I would handle it differently if I had another shot at it. And also to talk about feedback itself, which is just basically how I communicate to somebody when I am giving them feedback about something that they said. So the scenario, and I'm just going to sketch it, was I was at a socially distanced outside dinner event recently at somebody's home, and they were saying things about politics that not only did I disagree with, but that I thought were factually incorrect. And in particular, they were talking about former President Barack Obama, and they were saying that, and one of them actually used the phrase "all lives matter," and what they said about Barack Obama was that he is not the first Black president, but that because his mother was white, and so he is not Black because he has white ancestors, was what was said. And I know these folks and have known them for a long time, and I know that they are historically, over the years, they've been friends of mine, and they just have not been fans of the former president. And that's cool. You know, I have my concerns of my own about Obama's record on a couple of matters. And I don't want to just be friends with people who vote for the same people I vote for or think the same way I do about different things. But in this case, what was being said was actually not true. It just wasn't accurate. Specifically, in this case, if we're going to get into the weeds of the argument itself, a person does or does not enjoy or benefit from white privilege, not based on who their ancestors are, but on whether they pass as white in a culture that is still struggling with systemic racism. And so what I said in the moment was, Barack Obama does not enjoy white privilege. That's what I said, which is true. And in that moment, in the conversation, what I really wanted was for us to not talk about this anymore, because we were at a party on their turf. It was their party. And I just didn't want to get into the muck with them about all this stuff. And that comment was taken nicely enough. Nobody said, nobody engaged me negatively on it. We didn't have a fight. We didn't have an argument. I just said it. I said, Barack Obama does not have white privilege. In the days after that encounter, I thought about it more because I thought, okay, this is a situation where, I don't want to talk about who votes for whom. It isn't even really about that. We were having a conversation about white supremacy and racism, which is a conversation that a lot of us need to have these days, particularly folks who do have white privilege. So it's a conversation that needs to happen on a certain level. And I thought what I, coulda, shoulda, woulda, like what would I have said if I had maybe had more courage, or just if I had just chosen differently and decided to behave more intentionally and to intervene more directly in what I wanted to say and where I wanted the conversation to go. And one of the things that I thought I might say would be to these friends of mine, I just want you to know that you can be fundamentally, bitterly, strongly opposed to the politician, Barack Obama. And I promise you, I will not think that you are a racist. I do not think that opposition to a politician means anything more than that alone, which is, I don't like his or her policies. I don't want to vote for that person. That's fair. It doesn't mean you're racist. It doesn't mean anything necessarily. I kind of wish that I had said that, because then I would have said, I don't want to debate facts with you. Like, if you're opposed to Barack Obama, that's cool. I don't like his Syria policy. I don't like the drone strikes issue with him, blah, blah, blah. But the second piece that I would want to say is, I don't want to argue with you about whether he is white or black, because that is a settled fact. He's a black man and he does not have white privilege. And we don't get to debate that stuff. Like, that stuff is, we can fight about it if we want to, but it's not fruitful. So I guess the key idea there that I wish that I had communicated was, you can have your position, and I am not going to label you because you have that position. I am not going to make a harsh and really challenging judgment about you for having your position. And I'm not going to argue with you about settled facts. I'm just, I don't want to have that conversation. Through all of this, I was mindful of the reality that I was on somebody, like I said, like I was on somebody else's turf. I was outside of their home at an event that they were hosting. And so I had to think about that too, because that changes things. It changes the dynamic and the context of what I'm saying. So a lot of these conversations that we want to enable one another to have, they're all contextualized. If somebody's in my home and they make a statement that I find to be factually untrue, or worse, damaging or threatening or potentially violent against a group of people or any other person, then I may behave differently than if I'm on their turf. I may have to make just different choices. And so this was an example where, what I say matters, and context matters, and exactly what I want from the conversation is what I need to focus on. So what I did not want was to get into a futile argument, and let alone a heated argument about a fact. I don't want to debate the fact, the reality of systemic racism. I don't want to debate the reality of the fact that one of our recent federal employees did not have white privilege. Those are facts I don't want to debate and get into the weeds with people about. But I'm happy to talk about issues or disagreements about issues. So all of that said, it also got me thinking about feedback. And, feedback is a tricky word. A lot of people get hung up on it and they get scared and freaked out about it because, like, if somebody says to you, may I give you some feedback? Sometimes it can raise your hackles, or it can just make you nervous. It can lead to stress hormones being released in your bloodstream, because when someone says, may I give you some feedback, it's only natural to kind of assume right out of the gate that they're about to tell you something negative about you, or something critical, or they're going to tell you something that you don't want to hear. And so in my work with the diocese in the College for Congregational Development, we do a lot of work around feedback to demystify the term, and to also give folks a more flexible way of understanding it, especially when we're dealing with some people. May I give you some feedback is a triggering phrase, because people have abused that phrase, or have done great damage to them in the past by saying something that sounds sort of therapist ready, right? May I give you some feedback? It sounds like I'm about to do something appropriate. And so if I'm misbehaving, I might get away with it, right? So, so if we take a second look at feedback, I can fold this back into my conversation. So I'm going to share the screen here and show you some of the fundamentals of feedback, or good feedback, when I'm giving information to somebody else that might drive conflict a little higher, sometimes for a good reason, or it might be information that makes them uncomfortable because it's personal to them, or it somehow might change our relationship. So good feedback, first off, is information about the person giving it. And so if you make a comment at the dinner table, like at the Thanksgiving table, and I get upset by what you said, that's information about me. Or if I don't get upset, that's information about me. And so if I say to you that the impact of what you said on me was X, Y, or Z, I'm telling you something about myself. And that's important to remember, especially when you're upset about what somebody said to you in feedback. Feedback is specific and descriptive. So an example of that would be, when you said all lives matter, I felt frustrated because that phrase and that debate right now, and that struggle in our nation, is potentially really damaging to people of color. And to say all lives matter, it has a negative impact on me. So what I said there, that was just a little bit of feedback, an example of one. What I said there was really specific. I did a behaviorally descriptive comment to start it off. When you said all lives matter, a general way would be, whenever you talk to me, I feel frustrated. That would be a general piece of feedback, and it's less valuable. Feedback is owned by the giver. My response is my response. If I'm upset about something that you said, I own that. That's me. And I'm not making you responsible for my emotional response to you. Feedback is from the heart. And what this means is it includes feeling words like I felt frustrated, or I felt confused, or I felt discombobulated, or I felt irritated, or I felt saddened, or excited, or triggered, or whatever. It describes an emotional experience which is inherently subjective, right? So when feedback is from the heart, you are owning the subjectivity of your feedback. I have a position about Barack Obama, just to use that example, that is subjective. It has to do with the fact that I am located in time and space, and I have a particular history, and I speak a particular language, and I've been enculturated in a specific way that makes my response to that politician very subjective. And so when I give you feedback about what you're saying about Barack Obama, that feedback is subjective. It's about my subjective experience. Feedback is timely. So at this point, several weeks after this encounter that I just described, it would not be appropriate for me to give them feedback about what we discussed that night. That was a long time ago now. And it would be strange and potentially more conflictual now for me to bring it up again. It's more about go and sin no more, in the sense of the next time I'm in an encounter like that, I might respond differently. But for now, I'm going to let that go by. If it were a bigger deal, then it still might be timely. If they had said or done something that was really sort of a red alert kind of situation, then I might still want to go back to them after all these weeks and follow up. But generally, we want to have feedback be as close to the event as possible. It's considerate of the person's capacity in the moment. Another dimension of the conversation that I described as an example was that some of the folks around that, like who were at that party, are going through some hard things right now. And we all are going through a really traumatic time of pandemic and fear. And so that makes it also, that's a thing that you have to keep in mind. Do I really want to engage this person right now? Or is this not the right time for it? Feedback is constructive. It's given as a true and supportive gift, which is to say that if you said something that I think is inaccurate or wrong, simply factually incorrect, and I take you on, like I decide to respond in a certain way, that's toward a positive goal. It's toward deepening my relationship with you, or increasing understanding between us. It's not about beating you or defeating you in an argument. It's not about hitting you over the head with facts. As gratifying as that might feel in certain situations. But the best way to respond to somebody is, I actually want to increase understanding and trust between us. And finally, it's invited. So the standard phrase is, may I give you some feedback? And again, that can sometimes give people the jumps because others have abused that phrase, or it has lost its elasticity in our sort of therapeutic age. So you might say something like, I want to circle back and talk to you about our conversation the other day, because I haven't been able to let go of a couple things we discussed. Can we talk about this again? You know, that would be an example of inviting further feedback. Or you could say, you know, when I look back at that event, when you and I were talking, there were a couple things that I reflected on that I would like to talk more with you about. Are you up for it? And they can say, no, let's leave it there because, I don't know, I'm having a procedure today and I have to stay focused, or I have to bring groceries to my mother today, or whatever it is. And that's okay. Like, you can always just go on by. So these are some of the fundamentals of feedback that I think can be helpful when we are trying to work with people about issues that can be controversial and they can be emotionally upsetting to folks. And definitely when we're interacting with others and the information that they have access to is suspect or just factually wrong or just really on the other side of a great divide. In this divided time and in this conflictual time, these are some basic rules of the road that can help us a lot. So with that, I'm going to kick this back to Carrie and stop the share. And again, I see that there is one question here. How successful are you in correcting biased information? I've corrected a few things online, and the best reaction I've received is that the comment thread is deleted, but it's gone downhill from there. And with an edit, biased or incorrect information. And I'm going to invite Carrie to respond to this, but I'll also respond to it. When it comes to the internet and social media, I try to correct information very rarely, and very carefully. My assumption, and this is just personal to me, my assumption is that social media and certainly comment threads within social media posts are one of the least promising ways to share ideas and change minds. And so my way of dealing with it when I do it is I stay close to I statements. So so I might say my comment might begin with, in my experience, this has happened, or I have known in my time that this was a better way to understand the issue. This happened not long after the killing of George Floyd, and there was an argument on social media along a related issue around race and white privilege, and the issue was, if I recall correctly, that it's not helpful when people of color express fatigue or frustration with white folks who are so late to the party. Like, a lot of people with white privilege only recently have started to grapple with that and to understand it. And to their credit, they are reading books and engaging in conversations that help them confront white privilege in themselves and their participation in systemic racism. And this is all good work that some white folks are doing, but it can be painful for people of color to see that happening, because in some cases it's re-traumatizing, or it's just upsetting and discouraging to see white folks be so late to the party, as it were. And it's just a really exhausting time to be a Black, Indigenous, or person of color these days. And somebody on the internet had said, that's actually not helpful to express that fatigue, because we should really be encouraging white folks to start these conversations. Well, it's also not helpful to say that. Like, people of color get to express fatigue just like everybody else, right? And so I waded into this because I felt like if I didn't say anything, then I would be participating in white silence. And so I felt like I needed to make a comment. And so I very carefully wrote an I statement comment about an encounter that I had with a person of color, in which I noticed that they were seeming more fatigued than usual. And that I understood that, and that they weren't actually sharing with me a lot of the struggle that they were experiencing during this time. And that my hope is that, I can't remember exactly what I said, but my hope is that that my friend is able to be held and nurtured during such a rough time. Like, it was a very soft and yet I think a little bit firm I statement about my perspective on the issue. Now, I don't know how effective that was. I don't know if it changed any hearts or minds. It didn't get deleted. It didn't go downhill from there, as you phrased it, which I really get. It may or may not have been effective at all. I don't know. But it felt like news of a difference for me, because typically my instinct is to just not comment, because I have such little faith in social media being a force of changing minds, right? But it was just an experiment on my part of, I'm going to use an I statement to say my position on this. And so I'm not going to throw a rock at anybody. I'm just going to say, from my perspective, this is what I see. What I did hear from another friend was that it was comforting to him to see me say that. So it felt like, okay, I was helpful to somebody who was on the sidelines, because a lot of times with these comments, lots of people are reading these comments and not commenting themselves. And so sometimes the impact that you have, positive or negative, is on people who are not in the conversation, but are on the sidelines watching. So that was another thing to keep in mind too, was if I use I statements and I'm constructive and I'm positive and I'm from the heart, I'm using feeling words and I'm owning my experience, I tend to get a little further along when I do choose to comment. That's a lot of words. So Carrie, if you'd like to join in, it says that the Diocese of Olympia is going to answer this question live. Maybe that's
well,
what I just...
Actually, the Diocese of Olympia at this point is you, and you have answered the question very well. So okay. Thank you for that. Okay. I did want to ask, I'll direct a question for you, Stephen. On your website, stephencrippen.com, a nice plug for you there. You had mentioned that what is your greatest joy and your greatest fear? And your answer was, my greatest joy is reconciliation, and my greatest fear is a broken relationship that can't be repaired. So I was wondering if you'd like to speak to that part in regards to what we've talked about here in trying to prove fallacy over facts, and how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think like in the college, one of the things that we do is we lead people through the Myers-Briggs typology theory, which people are free to feel and think whatever they like about that typology. Some people think that it's scientifically bankrupt. Others really believe in the reliability of the data, blah, blah, blah. I don't want to fight about that. But in the Myers-Briggs framework, it talks about how folks tend to have a preference either for making decisions based on feeling or making decisions based on thinking. And if you make a decision based on thinking, that doesn't mean you don't have feelings. What it means is that in your decision-making process, you tend to focus on ideas and concepts or rules or structures or practical needs or logic. And if you have a feeling preference in decision-making, then you tend to make decisions with an eye more prominently toward relationships and values. And so an example of that would be if you're working in a business where layoffs need to happen, budget cuts need to happen, and that means a reduction in force. If you have a thinking preference, you're making that decision based on the bottom line of the organization, which is really important. You are using logic and analysis to make a just and good decision on behalf of the company. And that's very good. If you have a T preference, then that's what your perspective is. If you have a feeling preference, you're more concerned with, is the reduction in force consistent with our values as an organization? What are we going to do about morale? How are we going to cope with survivor guilt for those who don't get laid off? How are we going to do severance and other processes in this decision so that when we lay folks off, we do it in a way that takes care of them to the best of our ability and so forth. And so both perspectives are valid and good, but I have a preference for feeling in decision-making, which is to say that, to go back to that dinner party example, one of the most important things to me in that situation was my friendships with the people involved. And that was much more important to me than being right about an issue that we were discussing. And so for good and for ill, my priority was preserve the friendship. And I think that the for ill part of that is that I could sometimes sacrifice justice or truth for the sake of avoiding conflict or preserving a relationship with somebody. And so that could be a shadow of what I deal with or what my preference is. But a positive of it is that only in positive and developing relationships do we really change hearts and minds. And only by staying connected and working together can we actually get somewhere with some of these issues. And so my favorite Bible story about that, or my favorite sort of repaired friendship, is the one between Jesus and Peter, where they are friends and then some. Like Peter is his disciple. Peter becomes sort of the foundation person of the whole Christian church. But through all of that, their relationship, their friendship is prominent and powerful. And so when Jesus makes Peter the rock of the church, or gives him the keys to the kingdom, as it were, he does it while repairing their friendship by the sea at breakfast, right? And so he takes Peter through this threefold repair of his three denials of Jesus. And so that for me is a very inspiring story, and probably my funeral gospel, because it emphasizes the power and importance of relationship. So if I'm at the Thanksgiving table with that uncle, that sort of stereotypical uncle who has opinions that I think are bunk or based on false information, or my uncle, watches a different news source than I do and has all kinds of wrong information, in my opinion, the first place I personally, Stephen, go is, how can I stay in relationship with my uncle? How can I be in relationship with this person when we're done? And again, there's a shadow to that, but I think the positive of it is really clear, at least for me, which is that I don't know if I'm ever going to get someone who disagrees with me to agree with me. I don't know if I'm ever going to convince someone that they have access to false information, or that they are basing their argument on fallacies. I don't know if I'll ever get there with folks on that stuff, but if I do, it's going to happen in our friendship. And so that takes me back to the feedback stuff, where if I want, if somebody says something like all lives matter, or they say something that I know to be factually false, and I respond to them with I statements and with feedback that's appropriately crafted and delivered in a timely way, and I stay true to the values that drive my relationships, I think I'll get further with folks. So I think about that too in comments on the internet. So I comment very rarely on controversial posts. I am, I think, on the reluctant side of the continuum in terms of engaging with folks on social media. But when I do, I am highly tuned to the relationship that is in play there. And if it goes south, if it does go downhill, I tend to grieve that. And so, I've got skin in the game in that sense. And another thing that I think really helps in this discussion is be prepared to fail, and just maybe try to fail upward. So like if you're making comments and they go downhill, try to glean some wisdom from that, and allow that to inform your continued experimentation with these kinds of things.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any other questions that people would like to pose? If not, I want to thank you all for attending. Hope that this was worthwhile to you and that you got something out of it. We will be posting this up on YouTube within the next few days. We do want to thank you for attending this webinar, and especially I want to thank Stephen Crippen for his insights on this, because I think that one of the things I wanted to do was to make sure that even though if you knew the facts on how to refute something, how do you do it in a loving way? And I think Stephen covered that very well. And so again, thank you for Stephen for your input on that. Without further ado, thank you for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.